The first thing I noticed was the cold. Not the kind that comes in from outside when a door opens, not mountain air or rain-cool wind, but a deep, mineral cold, like I was standing in the throat of a cave. It pressed through the floorboards into my boots and climbed my legs in a slow ache. The house smelled wrong, too. Damp wood, old plaster, and beneath that something like wet stone split open underground. I had already walked through the front door once. I knew I had. My notes were still warm in my hand from where I'd written the room order down. Front hall, parlor on the left, narrow dining room, kitchen at the rear. That was what I had written. But when I opened the front door and stepped out, the porch was gone. There was only packed dirt and a stand of trees spaced with such perfect, even gaps between them that they didn't look planted, they looked placed. Like a sketch of a forest waiting for the real thing to load in around it. My own footsteps came back to me a fraction late, soft against the leaves after I'd already stopped moving. Behind me, the front door clicked shut. I turned and saw the number plate beside it. 118. I stared at it because it hadn't changed and because it had. The same number, the same chipped white paint, but the strokes were different, narrower than before, careful where the other set had been blunt, like someone else had come along and copied the number exactly by memory. Then something moved inside the wall to my right. Not scraping, not crawling, shifting. As if the house had realized I was looking at the wrong version of it and was correcting the mistake. I remember standing there with the chalk dust on my fingers, the cold coming up through solid boards that no longer met the ground where they should have, and thinking one thing with a clarity I haven't felt before or since. What had Silas Breckenridge seen that made him write those rules like he'd already broken them? That was 6 days into the job. By the time Clay County came down to me, I was already leaving. Not in the dramatic sense. I wasn't storming out of the office or giving a speech or throwing my county badge on a desk. I had transfer paperwork half finished in a manila folder that smelled like dust and carbon copy ink. Another week, maybe 2, and I'd have been moved out of field audits and into records verification in Charleston somewhere with fluorescent lights, climate control, and addresses that stayed where a map said they were. That was the plan. Quiet. Sensible. The sort of plan a man makes after enough years driving one-lane roads through wet timber, checking abandoned structures nobody wanted and nobody claimed. I wasn't afraid of isolated properties. I understood them. That was the problem. There are places in Appalachia that get left behind without ever fully going away. Mining camps, flood houses, farmsteads after the families thin out and drift west. Cabins with mailboxes still standing 20 years after the roofs cave in. Most of my work was simple. Verify the parcel, document condition, note access, confirm whether the county could proceed on delinquent tax action or whether the land had to sit in limbo a little longer. It was paperwork with mud on it. Silas Breckenridge had handled the stranger assignments. He'd done the remote audits longer than I had. Longer than anybody still in the office. He had a way of talking about bad roads and broken deeds that made them sound like old machinery. Something that could still be understood if you listened to it long enough. Then he disappeared mid-survey outside Clay. No distress call. No truck found wrecked in a ravine. Just a county radio left open on static and a field bag returned 3 days later by a deputy who couldn't explain where he'd found it except to say it had been sitting under a covered porch on a parcel that wasn't listed in dispatch. Nobody said much after that. Offices don't. They absorb people and keep their shape. What came to me from Silas was a canvas notebook with water-swollen edges and a smell like mildew and cold rock. His handwriting pressed hard enough into the paper to score the next 3 pages. I expected coordinates, measurements, maybe old tax references. What I found instead were corrections. Not instructions, corrections. The kind a man writes after his first assumptions nearly get him killed. Never enter a structure twice using the same doorway. If a room feels smaller than it looks, leave before closing any doors. Mark every exit physically. Do not trust memory. If the property address repeats exactly, you are already inside it twice. Do not acknowledge any structure that appears after you have begun the audit. There were no explanations under them. Just those lines written and rewritten in places with some older wording scratched out so hard the paper feathered under my thumb. He hadn't composed them in safety. He'd refined them. At the time, I still thought they were the coping habits of a field man who'd spent too many years alone on county roads. That detail seemed minor then. I've thought about it every day since. Darlene Kitts brought me the assignment personally. That should have been my first clue. She was the county liaison for disputed parcels and inherited land claims, the person who stood between field reports and whatever version of order the courthouse could still pretend to maintain. She never came downstairs to records unless something was jammed hard enough that it needed a body, not an email. I can still remember the smell of the coffee on her coat, burnt and bitter, and the rain ticking against the office windows behind her. "It's routine," she said, setting the ledger copy and Silas's notebook on my desk. "Abandoned structure verification, old tax record, needs confirmation before the quarter closes." Routine enough to hand me Breckenridge's notes? Her eyes didn't move from me for a second too long. Routine enough that I don't want you improvising. I flipped open the ledger copy. The paper was older than I was, dry and yellow at the edges with a parcel notation from the early 1970s and no digital match in the modern system. No owner listed, no transfer history, just a route reference that hadn't existed for decades and a house number, 118. "I checked GIS," I said. "Nothing comes up on that line." "It won't." She said it too quickly. I looked up. The room hummed with the courthouse heater and smelled faintly of wet wool from all the coats hanging by the door. Darlene stood with her hands folded in front of her, calm enough to look rehearsed. "So why are we verifying it?" "Because the ledger says it's there." "That isn't an answer." "It's the only one you'll get before you go." There was grief in the way she said that, though I didn't understand what she was grieving yet. Maybe Silas. Maybe the fact that there was always going to be another man in the truck after him. Maybe me, ahead of schedule. I should have refused. Transfer or no transfer, I still had that right. But I'd spent enough years in county work to know when a task had already been decided above my objections. And if I'm honest, part of me wanted to close out whatever had taken Silas Breckenridge off the board. He'd trained me in pieces over bad coffee and ledger dust and long drives. He believed competence could turn any wilderness into a process. I believed him for a long time, so I signed the assignment sheet, put his notebook in my field bag, and told Darlene I'd make the drive in the morning. She nodded once, no relief, no thanks. As she turned to go, she rested 2 fingers on the swollen canvas cover of Silas's notebook and said very softly, "If the place gives you trouble, don't try to make it make sense while you're inside it." Then she left me alone with the smell of damp paper and a job that was supposed to be my last. The drive into Clay County started in mist and ended in a kind of silence that felt structured. You can hear a normal mountain road even when you're alone. Water moving somewhere below the grade, insects in the weeds. The occasional rattle of loose gravel under your tires that tells you how close the shoulder is. By the time I turned off the maintained road and started following the outdated route notation from the ledger, most of that had thinned away. The woods stood dark and wet on either side, trunks black with old rain. My truck bounced over washouts that shouldn't have passed as a road in any decade I knew. and still the route kept holding together in front of me as if use had returned to it just far enough ahead for my headlights to catch it. The ledger's coordinates were useless by modern standards. Too broad, too old. I worked from topographic references instead, then from a creek bend that still existed, then from the rise of land the older survey described as if the hill itself were a fixed instrument. That's the kind of work I was good at. Reading past the failure of good records, letting old descriptions line up with what the land still remembered. When I first saw the house, it looked like it had been waiting for me. No collapsed porch, no busted windows, no vine-choked siding. It sat back from the road behind a low fence line with one section sagging inward, neat enough to be occupied if not for the stillness around it. The clapboards were pale with age but not rotten. The front steps held their weight cleanly when I tested the first one with a boot. Rain had dried on the railing in thin tracks. Somebody at some point too recent for comfort had kept the place from falling apart. And yet the county had no owner for it. No utilities, no tax payments, no foreclosure file, not even a code complaint. The air around it smelled of wet leaves and that same cold mineral note I'd later learned to fear, though it was faint then, easy to write off as spring runoff under the foundation. I stood at the gate and listened. No dogs, no insects. Just a little wind in the brush and once a hollow tapping from somewhere behind the house that stopped when I took 2 steps forward. The number plate was fixed beside the front door, 118. It matched the ledger exactly. That bothered me more than if it hadn't. Remote properties drift through records all the time. Numbers get lost, replaced, guessed at by a mail carrier or a cousin or whoever last thought a house might still matter. Exact matches on bad paperwork are rarer than errors. Exactness means maintenance. It means someone kept the fiction tidy. I started with exterior photos and notes. Standard practice, foundation, roofline, access points, signs of occupancy. I spoke into my recorder and listened to my own voice come back a little flat in the open air as if the trees were swallowing the edges of it. The house itself was small, maybe 1,200 square feet if the footprint meant anything. The windows on the left side were spaced a little too evenly. The right side had 3 porch posts across a span that should have needed 4, but the roofline above them hadn't sagged to account for it. The chimney rose from a pitch that would have put it half inside the front room if the interior matched the exterior proportions. That was the first wrongness. Not dramatic. Not enough to stop me. Just the feeling you get when a familiar object has been copied from memory by something that understands function better than use. I walked the perimeter twice. The ground felt uneven under the grass, like old roots or sinkage, but every time I looked down the surface lay smooth and level in the pale afternoon light. At the rear of the property, the fence line ended against nothing. No break, no snapped post. It just stopped, with the wire neatly stapled to the last upright as if there was no reason for it to continue. I checked Silas's notebook before I went in. Most of the pages were field shorthand and partial sketches that made less sense the longer I looked at them. But one thing caught my eye right away. In the margin beside a rough floor diagram written much earlier than the rest was the number 118. Not the house number noted from the ledger, not copied cleanly into a heading, just written there, like he'd needed to remind himself. A cold draft moved across the porch and raised the sweat on the back of my neck. I shut the notebook, took the chalk from my bag, and told myself I was still in control of the day. I believed that until I opened the door. The inside of the house held the cold the way a cellar holds it. It wasn't stale. That would have made sense. Abandoned properties trap air and mildew and old heat in the walls. This was fresh cold, active cold, moving out from deeper in the structure in little currents that touched my wrists and throat as I stepped into the front hall. The smell of damp wood was stronger inside, but the note beneath it was unmistakable now. Stone. Wet stone. The kind you smell in a cut hillside after heavy rain where the earth shows its older layers. I marked the exterior frame with a line of white chalk at eye level, and another lower down where my hand would find it fast if I had to push through in dim light. Then I said the mark out loud into my recorder, more for habit than nerves. Front entry chalked, beginning interior sweep. My footsteps on the floorboards came back wrong, not loud, not ghostly, just late. A fraction of a second after each step, I heard the same tread behind the first one, like the house was repeating my movement after thinking it over. I stopped 3 times before I accepted it wasn't my imagination. Every stop brought the same result. Silence, then the last faint echo arriving from no direction I could identify. The front hall opened into a parlor on the left, narrow dining room on the right, staircase at the back. That matched the kind of house the exterior suggested, and for a few minutes I relaxed into procedure. I logged wall condition, signs of water damage, missing fixtures. I checked window latches and rear access. The rooms were dusty but not neglected. Furniture was gone except for a small table in the dining room with a ring stain in the wood like a glass had been lifted from it an hour before. In the kitchen, one cabinet door stood open just wide enough to show darkness inside, and the air coming from it was colder than the room. I never touched it. What unsettled me wasn't any single object. It was the dimensions. The parlor looked broad enough from the doorway, but when I crossed it, the far wall met me too soon. The kitchen seemed shallow until I turned and saw how much space the back wall should have occupied. In the dining room, the distance from the table to the plaster was short enough that I should have been able to brace a hand on both at once. But I couldn't. Every room was close to right, close enough that my eye tried to accept it, my body didn't. If a room feels smaller than it looks, leave before closing any doors. I remembered that line while standing in the dining room with the cool air touching the inside of my sleeves and the floor under me feeling just slightly pitched to the left, though the table stood level. I still finished the walkthrough. That's what competence does when it becomes habit. It tells you to complete the sequence, to gather more information before you adjust the plan. I marked the rear door with chalk. I marked the side utility exit. I sketched the room positions in my notebook and compared them to the exterior footprint. The measurements didn't hold together, but not wildly enough for me to call it anything except bad intuition and an older house built with irregular framing. Looking back, that was the last moment I could have walked away and been fine. I left through the front door because I'd come in through the front door, and at that point I still believed doorways were simple things. The outside air felt warmer than it should have. I stood on the porch, listened to the trees, and looked at the chalk mark I'd made on the frame. It wasn't there. I checked both places, eye level, lower frame, bare paint, no dust, no smear, no trace that I'd ever touched the wood. I remember rubbing my thumb over the spot and feeling the rough grain under clean paint while a delayed version of my last step sounded softly behind me from inside the house. The front door was still open. I should have left then, I know that. But I told myself the chalk had failed. Damp surface, old habit. I took the piece from my pocket, stepped back onto the porch, and reached for the frame again. That was how I entered the property twice, through the same doorway. The second time, the house accepted me differently. The cold hit first, sharper than before, with a wet mineral smell that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then the silence changed. On my first sweep, the house had been quiet in the way abandoned places are quiet, full of little settling noises too small to identify. On the second entry, it sounded attentive. The boards under my boots gave off short, dense creaks that stopped the instant I shifted my weight. The air in the hall moved around me as if other passages had opened somewhere out of sight, The front hall was longer, not by much, maybe 3 feet, maybe less. But the coat nook that had sat near the parlor entrance was gone, and the staircase at the rear was turned a few degrees so the banister took more of the center line than before. I stood still long enough to feel the floor's unevenness through my soles, a shallow rise under the left boot that wasn't visible when I looked down. My throat had gone dry. The house smelled colder, if that makes sense. The stone note wasn't underneath the wood now. It was the dominant thing. I backed out onto the porch immediately and looked at the number plate. 118. Same number. Different hand. The old paint had looked square, heavy, almost stamped. This version was thinner, each stroke slightly tapered, with the 8 closed tighter at the waist. Fresh enough that I could smell the oil in it under the damp air. I put 2 fingers against the plate. Dry. Not tacky. Finished long enough ago to have cured. I opened Silas's notebook right there on the porch, my fingers stiff with cold, though the afternoon wasn't that bad. The rule looked worse in daylight than it had in the office. If the property address repeats exactly, you are already inside it twice. Not if the number changes. Not if you see the same plate again. Repeats exactly. I looked from the note to the house number and felt something give way in my understanding. Not panic, something colder than panic. The sense of a framework failing under load. I had entered once, performed a sweep, exited, and re-entered. Simple sequence. But the rule wasn't phrased for sequence. It was phrased for overlap, already inside it twice. I stepped off the porch and walked 10 yards into the yard just to feel distance working the way it should. The grass gave softly under my boots. Wet earth smell. Breeze from the tree line. All normal except that when I turned back, the house looked a little narrower than it had from the porch. Not farther away. Narrower, like the dimensions were rebalancing now that I'd stopped looking from inside. That was when the wall to the right of the front door gave a muffled internal thump, the sound of weight shifting between studs, as if something in the house had just moved from one side of a line to the other. I didn't go home. I wish I could say I had. I sat in the truck with the windows cracked, breathing in dust and old vinyl and the faint heat of the engine, and I did what I'd always done when a field problem stopped behaving like a field problem. I started building a case. Silas's notebook had pages stuck together from water damage. I separated them carefully, smelling mildew and old graphite as the paper peeled apart in strands. The first half was what I'd seen already. Parcel notes, partial sketches, the rules. The back half was stranger. Not because of what it said, but because of how often it contradicted itself. Hall counts that changed between entries. Window placements amended 3 times on the same page. Little directional arrows that had been crossed out and redrawn until the paper tore. And everywhere, carved into the margins with so much pressure the page had nearly split, were initials. SB. At first I thought they were just ownership marks, a habit from men who spend years losing tools to county trucks and storage rooms. Then I found the same initials cut into the house itself. The first one was on the rear kitchen frame, low and partially hidden where the door had once swung. I found it by touch before I saw it. The groove was rough under my thumbnail, packed with old dust and paint. SB cut deep enough to survive at least 1 coat of whitewash. 2 more were in the upstairs hall, one above shoulder height and one near the baseboard, layered over each other as if the same place had needed marking more than once. In the side room off the stair landing, the wood around the initials had been scored so many times the grain had furred outward. He hadn't been tagging where he'd been. He'd been trying to identify where a place had returned. There's a difference. Behind a loose panel in the upstairs room, I found a torn page folded into a square so small it had nearly fused with the wood. It crackled dry when I opened it. No header, no date, just lines written in a rush hard enough to dent the paper. Failed exits are not failed doors. They are completed observations. Do not finish the house for it. If you can still leave part of it undescribed, it will not keep the same shape for long. And lower down, under a smudge that might have been water or sweat, 118 appears before arrival. If it repeats, you've overlapped the approach. I read that line 3 times with the smell of old dust and damp plaster in my nose and the floor faintly sloping under my boots. 118 appears before arrival. That answered one question and opened a worse one. The property wasn't simply changing while I moved through it. It was presenting itself ahead of observation, seeding its own confirmations into notes and records before I reached them. Either that or the order of events inside and around it wasn't as settled as I believed. Then I found the maps. Silas had tried to draw the interior at least 7 times, maybe more. The pages were layered with tracings, some done in pencil, some in darker pen, some on top of older lines he refused to abandon. When I held them at arm's length, I could make out a pattern beneath the chaos. Not a floor plan, a behavior. Rooms shifting inward around documented edges. Doors multiplying where he'd noted access. The house getting more detailed where he'd been most thorough. Expanding when fully documented. That wasn't written as a theory. It was written as a warning, twice underlined, then half scratched out like he'd hated seeing it in plain words. I went back downstairs slower than I'd come up. The delayed echo of my steps returned after each tread, softer now, as if the sound were traveling through more than one version of the staircase before it reached me. In the dining room, the table was gone. In its place stood a narrow cabinet that matched nothing else in the house, its varnish fresh enough to smell under the dampness. I didn't acknowledge it. By then I'd remembered the last rule. Do not acknowledge any structure that appears after you have begun the audit. Structure, not object, not person. Structure. That distinction made my skin go cold in a way the air couldn't manage. A cabinet could be furniture, a staircase extension, a hallway, a door where no door had been. Those were structures, components, new geometry. If the rule existed, somebody had encountered additions that depended on being noticed. I backed into the front hall and radioed Darlene Kitts for the first time. The static answered before she did. Not loud, just a dry hiss with a wet undertone like rain falling very far away in a tunnel. When her voice came through, it was immediate, almost as if she'd been waiting with the handset in her hand. You still inside? I looked at the radio, then at the notebook in my other hand. Why ask it that way? A pause. I heard paper moving near her microphone. Status on the interior. I haven't given you any interior. No, she said, you haven't. There was courthouse noise behind her, faint and wrong for the hour. A filing drawer, a distant phone. It grounded me for half a breath. Then she said in the same level tone, did the narrow room off the back hall stay on your right, or did it move upstairs on you? I felt all the heat leave my face. I hadn't described that room to anyone. I hadn't even named it in my notes because I couldn't account for it on the exterior footprint. The air in the front hall seemed to thin around me, carrying that wet stone smell out from the stairwell. How do you know about that room? Answer the question, Everett Halcombe. The way she used my full name made the house feel closer. It was downstairs when I first entered, I said. Upstairs on the 2nd. She exhaled once, very quietly. Not surprise, confirmation. I moved farther from the walls before I spoke again. What is this place? It's a parcel under review. Don't do that. Then don't ask for a clean answer from inside an active site. Active site. I can still hear the soft scrape of that phrase under the radio static. Active. Not disputed. Not abandoned. Not unregistered. as if the property were performing some process the county had long ago stopped pretending to understand. "Did Silas tell you that?" I asked. Another pause. Then, "Silas tried to complete one." "Complete what?" "The audit." A board shifted overhead, just one, a small settling knock that traveled across the ceiling from left to right, as if weight had passed from room to room. Darlene went on before I could respond. "Listen carefully. You are not there for taxation, and you are not there for ownership verification. Those records are bait and braces. We send an auditor because observation has to be bounded, partial, physical, human, and inconsistent. That's what keeps a site from settling too close to people." I stood very still. The radioplastic was slick in my palm with sweat. "You send someone inside to keep it from—" I stopped because the word forming in my mouth sounded insane. "Stabilizing? That's close enough. And if the audit's incomplete, then it stays open." "Open to what?" This time the silence lasted long enough that I heard my own breath, the radio hiss, and the faint delayed return of both from somewhere deeper in the house. Finally, Darlene said, "Just finish the audit. Don't leave it incomplete." It was the most frightened I'd heard her sound, and that frightened me more than anything in the house had yet. "That's the opposite of what Silas wrote." "I know." "You know?" I said I know. Her voice sharpened. I could hear her losing patience or composure or both. "His notes were field notes, corrections made under pressure. They weren't written for you to follow blindly." "Then tell me the rule." "The rule is that these places have to be engaged." "Engaged isn't a rule. It's all I've got time to give you." I should have kept pressing. I should have forced it out of her while I still had a clear line and something like a witness outside the property. But then she asked, "When you came out the first time, were the trees normal?" The breath caught in my throat before I could stop it. She heard it. "Everett Halcombe," she said very quietly now, "how many exits have you marked?" I looked down at my notebook, at the little diagram I'd made of front, rear, and side access. 3 marked exits, 3 defined boundaries, 3 ways of teaching the house where its edges should be. "Too many," I said. Her answer came fast. "Then do not complete the perimeter." The radio clicked dead. I don't know whether she cut the transmission or the property did. I know only that the silence after was absolute, heavy in the air, carrying a smell like soaked stone and fresh paint. At the time, I thought Darlene Kitts was hiding the truth from me. I know now she was trying to keep me from understanding it too soon. I made my first serious exit attempt through the rear door. The chalk was still there, bright on the frame. That alone should have told me the house had decided the rear mattered more than the front. I put my hand on the latch, felt cold metal, dry and solid, and opened onto what should have been the backyard. Instead, I stepped into the side yard. The fence line I'd seen earlier ran away to my left, not behind me. The porch sat at the wrong angle to the road, and the trees beyond the grass were spaced in perfect intervals, trunk after trunk after trunk, each gap between them nearly identical, as if the land had been measured by something that understood distance but had never once needed shade. The smell outside had changed. Less leaf mold, more wet mineral cold, as though the house had exhaled itself over the whole parcel. Under the grass, the ground felt subtly ridged, like floor joists buried shallow under soil. When I stopped moving, my footsteps returned to me a heartbeat late from the tree line ahead. I turned at once and looked back through the open rear door. The kitchen was gone. Beyond the threshold lay the upstairs hall. Not dark, not obscured, plainly visible in flat afternoon light with Silas's carved initials near the baseboard where I'd seen them before. I shut the door and opened it again. Front hall. I closed it. Opened it. Pantry. Closed. Opened. A narrow passage I had never seen. walls too close together leading toward a square of gray daylight that might have been another door or another window or nothing at all. I left that one shut. From then on, every marked exit betrayed me in a different way. The side door returned me to the porch, but the porch faced a stand of identical trees instead of the road. The front door let me out onto packed dirt that circled the house and led, after 20 paces, back to the same front steps from a new angle. Once I opened the chalked frame at the upstairs landing and stepped through into the yard only to find the house behind me had no second floor at all. Just a roofline sloping down where I'd been standing seconds earlier. The property had expanded beyond the structure. That was the moment the idea stopped being metaphor. It wasn't just that the interior no longer matched the exterior. The exterior itself had been folded into the same behavior, rearranged into temporary correctness around the fact of my observation. Every door I'd physically marked had become an anchor point. Every documented exit was a place the property could use. My notes were helping it. I stood in the center of what should have been the front yard, breathing air that smelled like rain on cut rock and turned in a slow circle. Trees, evenly spaced. House, fence, trees again. If there was a road beyond them, I couldn't hear it. No engine noise, no creak, no distant dogs. Only the soft, delayed return of my own movement after each step, as if another Everett Halcombe half a second behind me were walking the same parcel with the same caution. I checked the house number from 3 different sides of the structure. Every visible approach had 118, sometimes nailed to the siding, once painted on a mailbox that hadn't existed when I arrived, once hanging from a porch post in black metal numerals cold enough to sting my fingers. The same address repeating exactly. Already inside it twice. No, more than twice. I understood that then with a heaviness that made my stomach drop. The loop wasn't simple repetition, it was overlap, approach, entry, documentation, exit attempt. Each completed line of attention gave the property another way to hold its own shape. I wasn't stuck in a haunted house. I was inside a spatial behavior that had learned how to use a county audit as part of its process. I went back inside because outside had ceased to mean anything. The front hall had widened. The air there was colder than the yard by 10 degrees if it was a degree, and the smell of damp wood had thinned almost entirely beneath the scent of stone and fresh lime paint. Somewhere behind the walls, something shifted in sections. Not footsteps, not pipes. Planes moving against each other, studs deciding where they belonged. I took my chalk from my pocket, looked at the blunt white stub and realized with a kind of exhausted clarity that all my habits were built for stable places. This wasn't one. By then I was tired enough to think clearly. That's a dangerous kind of tired, not panic. Panic burns hot and fast. This was the calm that comes after too many contradictions, when your brain stops trying to protect itself and begins accounting for them instead. The house was not fixed in physical coordinates. The parcel was not a parcel in any ordinary sense. Observation and documentation were not neutral acts. They were inputs. So I sat on the staircase where the wood felt cold through my jeans and the delayed echo of the house settling kept coming back from somewhere overhead, and I spread Silas Breckenridge's notes across my knees. His pages made sense once I stopped reading them like maps. He wasn't charting where rooms were. He was tracking what kinds of attention produced what kinds of changes. Quick passes versus careful measurements. Physical marks versus remembered routes. Doorways reused versus alternated. Described spaces versus undescribed voids. Over and over, in whatever order the site had forced him to learn it, he had been circling one conclusion. A property like this could be engaged, disturbed, nudged, and even temporarily constrained. But if you completed it, if you resolved every uncertainty, matched every interior to every exterior, marked every exit, accounted for every room, Then the thing beneath the appearance of property stopped being unstable enough to localize. It settled. That was the maximum revelation, and the ugliest part of it was how ordinary the mechanism sounded once I understood it. County records, parcel verification, a man with a clipboard and chalk. The hidden world had folded itself into bureaucracy because bureaucracy produces bounded human observation. Not too much, not too little, enough to keep a place provisional. Silas had failed because he was good at his job. He had tried to complete the audit. I looked up from the notebook and saw him. Not all at once. First the smell changed, a brief gust of wet wool and old paper that did not belong to the house. Then the temperature dropped along the upstairs hall while the lower floor stayed the same. Then through the doorway opposite the stairs I caught motion in the angle of a hall that should not have aligned with my current position. Silas Breckenridge walked past the opening with a piece of chalk in his right hand. I knew him by build before I knew him by face. Narrow shoulders, slight forward lean from years of leaning over ledgers and truck hoods. County field jacket, dark at the cuffs from old rain. He moved with the exact practical economy I remembered from every site visit we'd shared. No wasted motion, no hesitation visible from the outside. He passed the doorway, then returned in the other direction a second later, even though there was no branching hall on the far side that could have let him turn around. I stood slowly. The air around me had gone thin and biting like winter air drawn through a basement. Silas. He did not react. He knelt at a doorframe halfway down the hall and marked it with chalk at eye level, then lower down with the same two-part motion I had used earlier that day. Not similar. Exact. The gesture, the pressure, the brief wipe of his thumb against his pants after. He was repeating Everett Halcombe's earlier actions before my eyes, or I was seeing his. The order no longer mattered. His face came into view when he rose. Not damaged, not dead, just distant. Slightly out of sync with the rest of the hallway, as if the edges of him were arriving a fraction later than the center. His expression was flat with concentration. Professional. Focused on the work. He moved deeper into the house. I didn't follow. I understood too much at once. Silas wasn't haunting the property in any simple sense. He was embedded in one of its active lines of observation, still performing the audit somewhere adjacent to me in the overlap the repeated address had warned about. The temporal echo wasn't an illusion generated for my benefit. It was evidence. Proof that the site used recurrence the way a normal structure uses walls. Multiple attempts, multiple passes, multiple auditors maybe, all stacked just close enough to leak through when the geometry lost its clean separation. Who created the rules? Silas had written some of them, yes. I knew that now from the torn page and the carved initials, but not all. The oldest lines in the notebook had been copied from somewhere else, corrected by him, revised again under pressure. That meant this system long predated Silas Breckenridge. The county hadn't stumbled onto one impossible property. It had inherited a method for handling many of them, likely for longer than anyone alive in that office would willingly admit. How many of these unregistered properties existed across the region? I still don't know. I don't think Darlene knew either, but in that hallway, watching Silas disappear around a corner that the house had not possessed 5 minutes earlier, I knew there were more than one. Enough for procedure, enough for copied rules, enough for a county liaison to speak of active sites without once sounding surprised. And the last question, the one that stayed with me after everything else had broken apart, rose up then like cold water. Was I documenting the property, or was my presence part of what kept it from becoming something permanent? The answer was both. Once I had that, I knew what I had to do. I stopped trying to leave a coherent record. The first thing I did was tear out my neatest floor sketches and stuff them into the cold mouth of the kitchen stove. There was no fire laid there, but the iron interior smelled sharply of soot and wet rock, and when I struck a match, the flame burned low and blue for a second before catching the paper. My own careful lines curled black and lifted in the draft. I tore up the exterior measurements next, then the exit list, then every page where I'd resolved a room against the footprint. Not all the notes, never all. Silas's warning held. If you can still leave part of it undescribed, it will not keep the same shape for long. The goal wasn't ignorance. The goal was incompletion. Then I began erasing chalk, front frame first, the place where I'd first entered, then re-entered. The white line smeared under my sleeve and left a pale haze on the paint. Immediately, the hall behind me gave a low shifting complaint, as if load had been redistributed through a beam. I moved to the rear door, wiped both marks clean, and felt the floor under my boots dip and rise like a settling foundation finding a different support. The house started to misalign, not collapse. Collapse is a simple failure. This was disagreement made physical. Door frames leaned without the walls around them moving. The staircase changed pitch by degrees between one glance and the next. One upstairs room narrowed to a slit while the window centered in its far wall remained full-sized, looking out on a yard I could not have reached from any exterior angle. Air currents crossed each other in the hall, one warm as breath, one cold as spring water. Every time I erased another physical marker, the property lost one of the observations it had been using to remain legible. I stopped speaking into the recorder. I stopped naming rooms. When something new appeared, a short side hall branching off the pantry, a closed red door at the end of the upstairs landing, a covered breezeway visible through what had once been the dining room window, I kept my eyes moving and gave it nothing. No label, no speculation, no acknowledgement. The urge to categorize it was almost unbearable. That's what professional training is in the end. The compulsion to make an unknown thing enter a system. But the system was the trap. The more the structure destabilized, the louder the delayed echoes became. My footfalls returned out of order now. One close behind, one from farther off, one from a floor above when I knew I'd stepped on level boards. Underneath that, I heard walls correcting themselves in quick internal knocks, little dry impacts like parts of a model being snapped into temporary place. I found Silas once more during the worst of it. He stood in the front hall where the front hall had once been, though by then it opened onto 3 different spaces depending on how I approached it. He was kneeling again, marking a frame I'd just erased, his hand moving with tired determination. There was something heartbreaking in that. Not because he looked dead. He didn't. Because he looked busy, still trapped in the dignity of trying to finish the work properly. I said his name once under my breath, not to call him, but because I couldn't help it. His head turned a fraction, not enough to see me. Enough to show that one side of his face lagged behind the motion like a reflection catching up. Then he rose and walked through a doorway that folded shut after him with the soft internal sound of a room becoming unavailable. I kept erasing. When the last marked exit was gone, the property lost whatever stable relationship it had maintained between inside and outside. Daylight moved through the house in strips from impossible angles. A section of wall in the upstairs room drifted 3 inches out of line with the floor below it, leaving a black seam that smelled of rainwater and raw stone. The kitchen ceiling lowered until I had to duck, then lifted again when I backed out without looking straight at it. Through one open doorway, I saw the identical trees standing in rows under a gray sky. Through the next, I saw only darkness with the faint texture of interior wallpaper on it, as if another room had been turned inside out. I wasn't trying to find the correct exit anymore. I was waiting for the geometry to fail. That took longer than I'd hoped and less time than I'd feared. The house fought for coherence. You could feel it. Each time I moved without completing an observation, each time I refused to define a new addition, the place reconfigured around the gap, trying again. Hallway, porch, room, yard, stair. It wanted a finished shape badly enough that the desire became legible. Then I found the mistake. It was on the far side of the upstairs landing where a wall had slid half across a doorway and stopped. Not flush, not clean. Just enough out of line that the frame no longer met what surrounded it. Beyond the gap was a strip of dim light and air that smelled different from anything in the property. Not stone, not damp wood, asphalt after recent rain, warm engine residue, road, an unmarked doorway, no number plate, no chalk, no place for the house to recognize itself in my notes. The floor pitched hard under me as I approached, and for a moment I felt the old professional instinct rise one last time. Document it, confirm it, assess whether it leads to a valid exterior boundary. But there was no valid boundary here, only an opening the property had failed to integrate before the rest of its shape changed again. I did the smartest stupid thing I've ever done. I lowered my eyes so I wouldn't take in more of the frame than necessary. Put one hand on the cold splintered edge and forced myself through sideways before the wall could finish deciding what it was. The air changed mid-step. 1 foot on warped floorboard, 1 foot on wet pavement. Then I was out. I stumbled onto a narrow road I had never seen in Clay County, lined on one side by a ditch full of brown runoff and on the other by woods moving naturally in the wind. Naturally. That was the first thing I checked, not whether the house was behind me, the trees. They leaned irregularly, branches crossed. Underbrush thickened where it wanted to. The smell in the air was mud, road tar, and leaf litter. Ordinary damp country road. My knees nearly gave out from the relief of it. When I turned, there was no house behind me. Only a slope of brush and young trees descending into a fold of land too shallow to hold a structure of that size. My truck was parked on the shoulder 50 yards ahead as if I'd left it there on purpose. The engine was cold. My field bag sat on the passenger seat. My radio lay on the dash in silence. Nothing around me looked staged, but I had learned enough by then not to trust the first appearance of normality. I checked my watch. The hands had stopped. I checked my notebook. Every page I'd kept was still there, warped from damp fingers and smudged with soot from the stove. Silas's torn note remained folded in the back cover. My rough observations survived in fragments. Cold interior, delayed echo, repeating address, trees evenly spaced, Darlene's warning, all of it. But where the property ledger reference should have been, where the parcel notation and route line and address had anchored the whole assignment, there was only a blank entry. Not scratched out, not torn. The paper itself was empty, as if I'd never written the location down, one clean absence. That, more than anything, convinced me I had not escaped in any complete sense. Systems that erase their own containment records don't do it by accident. Whether the property had released me or absorbed the version of me that could testify cleanly against it, I couldn't say. I still can't. I drove until I found a state road I recognized. Then I drove to the county office with the heater on too high and both hands locked on the wheel because the sensation of uneven ground kept returning through the truck floor every time I looked at a map. Darlene Kitts met me in the lot before I killed the engine. The night air smelled of rain and courthouse concrete. She saw my face, saw the notebook in my hand, and didn't ask whether the audit was complete. "Is it contained?" I asked instead. She looked past me into the dark windshield as if expecting to see someone in the passenger seat. "For now," she said. Was Silas ever going to come back? That took her longer. Not the way you mean. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to hand her the notebook and tell her she could find the next fool herself. But the truth had already done its work on me. I understood the shape of the duty even as I despised it. Some of those places were real enough to drift. Some came near roads, near schools, near houses where people still lived ordinary mapped lives. And somewhere in the county's old paper machinery, generations of men and women had learned that partial, human, inconsistent observation was one of the few things that kept those properties from resolving into something worse. That didn't make it noble. It just made it effective. I never filed the transfer paperwork. I never filed anything again. County work requires trust in records, in plats, in fixed corners and reference lines, and the idea that if enough people verify a place, the place becomes more known and therefore more safe. I don't believe that anymore. Not fully. Not where land is concerned. Not where certain addresses are concerned. Darlene told me later, in one of the few honest conversations we ever had, that the road I came out on does not appear on any county map for many years. It exists just long enough for maintenance crews to report wash damage on it every few winters. Then it disappears from their route sheets the next season. Nobody can keep a file on it. Nobody remembers driving it unless they're already looking for another property that doesn't belong to the paper it appears on. I burned my field copies of the county ledgers after that, except for Silas's notebook. That I kept, not out of sentiment. Out of respect, maybe, and because the rules in it are older than either of us. He corrected them. So did I. The last line in the back is mine, written in a steadier hand than I felt while writing it. If an exit seems undescribed, leave before you understand why. I sleep badly now. Not because I dream about the house. I don't. Not often. It's worse than that. I notice things I didn't used to notice. Floor plans in public buildings that don't quite reconcile with the exteriors. Apartment doors numbered in fresh paint over older screws. Hallways that feel subtly uphill halfway through though the walls stay plumb. Most people never look twice. I always do. And I never enter anywhere twice through the same doorway if I can help it. People have asked me why I quit. I tell them field work got under my skin, that the roads got old, that I wanted a quieter life and found out too late I wasn't built for one. Those answers are close enough to true that nobody pushes harder. If I told them the rest, I'd hear it in their voices immediately. The polite distance people use when a story asks too much of their map of the world. So I keep it simple. I say there are properties in Appalachia that fall through the paper. I say some jobs shouldn't be done thoroughly. I say a missing record isn't always an error. Then I let the conversation die there. Every now and then, usually on wet mornings when the air smells like split stone and the house creaks settle a fraction late around me, I take Silas Breckenridge's notebook from the lockbox and read the rules again. The paper has gone softer with age. His indentations are still there beneath the ink. The pressure of a man trying to revise reality into language before it folded over him. Mine are there too now. Two hands in one field book, both trying to leave the next person less blind than we were. I still haven't decided whether that counts as mercy. What I know is this. I came out onto a road that shouldn't exist, with a notebook that no longer remembered where I'd been. And the county marked the assignment closed without ever giving me a parcel number to sign beside. Maybe that means I escaped. Maybe it means the containment completed itself through me and erased the part that could prove it. I don't check old ledgers anymore. But when I pass an unmarked turnoff in the hills and catch that cold mineral smell through the truck vents, I look at the tree line first. And if the spacing's too even, I keep driving. I still don't know whether that road took me away from the property, or whether it was only the last doorway I was willing to call outside.